In 1929, the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises published his book, A Critique of Interventionism, in which he observed the necessary tendency of mixed market interventionist economies to progressively move towards socialism or capitalism, rather than being capable of stasis. To quote, "If government is not inclined to alleviate the situation through removing its limited intervention and lifting its price control, its first step must be followed by others. There is no other choice. Government either abstains from limited interference with the market forces or it assumes total control over production and distribution. Either capitalism or socialism. There is no middle of the road." As economic interventions are directed to resolving problems, and any economic intervention necessarily generates distortions which interfere with human action, intervention results in a self-justifying state of affairs, where problems caused by previous interventions are then used to justify further and subsequent interventions ad infinitum. So long as the public are inclined to viewing the state as a means by which problems are solved, the limited state would eventually expand in scope to become unlimited, a true socialist monolith. The reason for this process can be understood by applying the objectivist theory of history and social development. It is not the interventions or problems themselves which lead people to call for more intervention, but rather the philosophy which they hold, which informs their reasoning as to how problems are solved. Having identified this, we can now understand this metaphor visually through what I call the arrow of regression. In a society where a philosophy of interventionism is ascendant, that society will move away from capitalism and towards socialism, in the process described by Mises. The specific reason there is no possible middle ground between socialism and capitalism is because the two positions are fundamentally contradictory. Any argument which justifies a limited intervention can be consistently expanded in scope to encompass an entire economy, and therefore any limitations placed upon it are fundamentally arbitrary. Likewise, an argument for a free market in one particular good applies to all goods, as there is no principal difference that can be made between them in this respect. While it is possible for people to hold mixed and contradictory ideas, in any given singular policy proposal, they must be consistent with only a single philosophy, and therefore the philosophy of the day will point the arrow in one direction or the other, and never will the ball be pinned in place somewhere halfway. And there's no stable local minimum, as men themselves are never static. So, what does this arrow actually mean for those of us who are advocates of liberty and students of the Austrolibertarian tradition? By understanding the arrow of regression, it allows one to rapidly identify where the principle behind a given policy points. And it is on the ground of principles, not individual policies, that the direction of travel is determined. Individual policies are merely consequences of principles in application. As such, we can stake our alignment with a given argument or advocate by analyzing the principle behind the argument being put forward. Put simply, by determining which way the arrow is pointing for a given argument, you can look past the individual policy being advocated and instead see where the consistent application will eventually lead. What does this actually look like in application? When analyzing any particular policy argument, it is possible to ask, does this argument imply that it is possible for the government to solve problems? If the answer is yes, then one can recursively reapply the principle behind that policy to every new problem generated and every field in society. And the fact is that this belief is mutually exclusive with the belief that the free market can solve problems. As such, the society will regress towards socialism. Likewise, if the answer is no, then it is naturally the case that, under that principle, society will regress towards capitalism. In short, with regards to any argument for a policy, one can simply ask, which way is the arrow pointing? To demonstrate the application of this analysis, I have selected a completely uncontroversial example from popular libertarian discourse. So, bordertarianism is the topic on which I first came up with this analysis and the idea of the arrow of regression. Briefly stated, the bordertarian identifies a selection of problems which are related to immigrants. Problems can be understood specifically as a scarcity that serves as a specific impediment to the acquisition of values, or a specific scarcity, rather. In the case of welfare, there is a specific scarcity of wealth of the productive class that is then needs to be redistributed to the parasite class, right? The unproductive class. And the more welfare benefits that need to be distributed, the greater that scarcity becomes. However, the productive class is using that wealth of their own to acquire their own values. In the case of democracy, there is the scope of democracy reaches the entire economy. So all scarce resources which are available for being directed to acquire values can be affected by democracy. Public property is maintained at the expense of the productive class, so similar to the welfare case, but public property itself is scarce and being used by people to acquire values. And in terms of crime, obviously your body and property are scarce values, and that conflicts over them is an impediment over your use of your acquisition of values with them. Now, the Libertarian identifies these problems and then states that the solution to these problems is a government immigration restriction. That is the specific defining feature of the Libertarian. Not that they want to enforce private property rights to evict immigrants, but that they want to violate private property rights of immigrants and people harboring immigrants. Applying our analysis here, we can see that the Libertarian has identified a problem and then stated that government can be used to solve the problem. However, this implies that the government can solve problems. And we also know that the enforcement of immigration restrictions will destructively interfere with the market, therefore causing new problems. For instance, the government will have to identify and track all potentially suspicious persons. By default, anyone who crosses the border is a criminal after all. And there'll be a need to issue universal government ID for ease of immigration law enforcement. And there will be labor shortages, as previously legal individuals have their status revoked overnight. And then businesses will shut down or be otherwise impeded. And we will see shocks across the economy, which call for more government control in order to stabilize the situation, and on and on and on until we reach the United Socialist Soviet of Earth. In summary, by the reasoning that government can solve problems, we will then, by consistent reasoning, need to apply government interventions to these other problems. And by regression, voila, we will have arrived at socialism. Now, the Libertarian has, in fact, identified real problems. There are indeed scarcities which impede the acquisition of values in each of these cases. However, we know that the government cannot actually solve these problems. That is, it cannot actually alleviate the scarcity which underlies these problems. At the very best, it can redirect resources from one place to another, but this will generate problems elsewhere. And in this case, we also know that all of these problems previously described have their roots in existing government interventions, that is, public property and the geographic monopoly in law enforcement that gives foreign immigrants an advantage in criminal affairs or just an advantage in general. Given this knowledge, we as libertarians can actually approach these problems rather than trying to paper them over. For instance, an open borders leftist will just ignore the notion of criminal ethnic enclaves, and a GDP-tarian will try to use some utilitarian statistical argument to say that it's overall worth it. These are both unacceptable for people whose acquisition of values is being actively impeded by these problems. We can actually speak to these people and say, yes, that is a problem, and there is a solution. The solution is a policy which defends private property. In conclusion, any policy argument is motivated by reasoning which either condones or rejects government. Condoning or rejecting government regresses either to socialism or anarchism/capitalism, and therefore, by analyzing any argument, you can determine whether it is socialist or libertarian. And if you are seeking to advocate for libertarianism, you should ask yourself, which way is the arrow pointing? Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I hope to make more interesting presentations in the future. Is there a way I can have this stay on top? Of course not, because Microsoft doesn't even know how technology works. Microsoft is not a real company. Windows is not a real operating system. It's an operating system invented to cause people suffering.